Okay, so some requirements, what we're going to be discussing about today, just so that you understand. Again, we're going to be talking about Form 8949. So that's used by those who are filing 1040 Schedule D. If that's not you, if you're filing mark-to-market accounting method or you're filing 1065 Schedule D, then this class may not be the best for you, and so you might want to leave, or you can stick around. It's up to you. I just don't want to waste your time. You should already be using TradeLog and have the most current version installed on your computer. We have had a few updates to version 9.1, so we encourage you to make sure and keep your software up to date. Also, you need to have your broker 1099-B in order to complete the steps we're going to discuss. If you haven't received your broker 1099-B, that's okay. You can still go through these steps, and when you do receive it, you'll be able to actually do this on your software. I know some of you still have not received 1099-Bs, or you might be awaiting a corrected 1099-B, so when those arrive, you can finish. And what we're going to be talking about today are steps that basically are steps 5 through 8 of our Quick Start Guide. So on the Quick Start Guide, steps 1 through 4 cover everything from importing your trade history to verifying year-end open positions. All of that needs to have been done in order to proceed with these steps. You can still, as I mentioned, if you haven't done that, you can still stay with us here, and we will be more than happy to explain what we're doing. But it is important that you complete those steps before you reconcile anything else. One quick question here that does kind of relate to what we just mentioned about different types of filing. Chip, you asked about futures. Futures are Section 1256 contracts, and so those are not reported on Form 8949. But they are included in Schedule D. It's just a separate line on Schedule D. So if you have all futures trades, then you don't have to do Form 8949. If you have just some trades that are futures, then you'll run those separate from the Form 8949. And I can discuss that a little bit more later. But futures trades are not subject to the wash sale rule, thank goodness. So anything that classifies for Section 1256 handling or futures doesn't have to have the wash sales adjusted on that. So that's a good thing. Okay, so we're going to continue now. What we're going to do first is we're going to review the status of your TradeLog file. Then we're going to actually reconcile a 1099-B. We're going to go through the end tax year process and discuss Form 8949. So let's talk about the status of your TradeLog file. These questions are questions you should be able to answer. Did you follow the instructions in TradeLog for creating a new tax year file, if this is your first year using TradeLog? Or if you used TradeLog in the past, have you followed the instructions for ending the tax year last year and using it in the new file created? If you didn't follow those instructions, then it's possible that your TradeLog file is not set up correctly. And just one moment here, I'll actually open up our Quick Start Guide and show you this just so that you're all familiar and you know what I'm talking about. Here on our Support Center online, we have the Quick Start Guide, and there's 8 steps, and these same steps are included in the software in TradeLog. And so these are the steps we're talking about, steps 1 through 4 that you need to have completed. The next thing we're talking about, did you import all of your trade data for 2011? And remember, for wash sale calculations, you also need to import data for January of 2012. This is important because we need that first 30 days of January in order to adjust for any wash sales that happened at the end of December. Also, if you had any errors like negative share errors, QSIP changes, stock splits, adjustments like that, those things need to be done before you reconcile your 1099-B. So if you haven't done those things, you need to do that first. When you reconcile the 1099, it might show if you didn't do that. And then, did you verify year-end open positions? That's something that's important, and it should be done before you reconcile your 1099, because what happens when you verify your year-end open positions is it tells us something about what's in TradeLog, and it tells us if the data you have is accurate. I'm going to show you a TradeLog file here, and in this file, if I click on the Open button and I click year-end open positions, in this particular file you'll notice it's blank. That means I didn't have any positions held open at the end of my tax year. And so what I want to do is check my broker statement, and I want to make sure that that is correct and that matches what I have in my brokerage file. So that is very important, because if that doesn't match, what it means is that there's probably something wrong, that trade data is missing somewhere. And so what we want to do is make sure that we have that corrected and before we continue on. All right, give me just 1 second here. Finish. Okay, looking at some questions that we have. We'll get those questions a little bit later. Okay, so if you can't answer any of those questions, if you haven't completed those steps in TradeLog, again, you can still stay with us, but you need to make sure to do that before finishing off your tax file. Okay, this stuff needs to be done before you reconcile the 1099. Also, a few notes that we want to talk about before you proceed is if you traded ETFs, mutual funds, or DRIPs, we want to make sure that those are labeled. That's very important for this tax year to be able to do that. Excuse me 1 second. There we go. So what we'll see this year is that mutual funds and dividend reinvestments, those are actually non-covered securities. If you've joined us on our other webinars, we've discussed the difference between covered and non-covered, and so those need to be labeled in TradeLog so that they can be properly categorized. If you have ETFs, well, the jury's out sort of on ETFs, whether they should be covered or non-covered. Many brokers are reporting them as covered securities, and for the most part, that is the consensus based on what the IRS has said. Some brokers are not reporting them as covered securities, and some brokers are reporting some ETFs as covered and some not covered. So that can be very confusing, and we'll touch on that more later. And I'm actually going to show you in the sample file we're going to use a good situation that involves ETFs. And of course, do you have your broker 1099-B? If you're trying to follow along with us today on these steps, I encourage you to have your 1099 open if it's a PDF, or have that handy now. I know I'm going to be using an Ameritrade 1099-B, so I have that handy here, and I've got it open in a PDF format. It's great having a PDF. It's easier to navigate sometimes, but the paper one will do as well. All right, so with that in mind, we can go ahead and proceed with our next steps. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up TradeLog. And what I want to talk about first in this file, now you'll notice I already have ETFs that are labeled in this file. If you have traded ETFs and you don't have them labeled, or you're not sure, what I encourage you to do is one of two things. You can open up TradeLog. If you have the latest version, you should be able to go to Global Options, and then within Global Options, under mutual funds, ETFs, ETNs, this is where we list all the known mutual funds, all the known ETFs. Okay, and so what you can do is click OK, and this should apply changes. Now, if it doesn't prompt you to save that, or if it doesn't make any changes, another option you can do is renumber trades, and sometimes that will force TradeLog to label. Basically, what happens is, because this was a new feature in TradeLog 9.1, any data that was imported prior to version 9.1, TradeLog has to kind of be told to, hey, go back and relabel or renumber those trades. So once that's done, the ETFs are labeled, we're good. If you have problems with that, just contact our support department, or even send in your file if you don't think your ETFs are being labeled right, and we can double check and make sure. As far as dividend reinvestments, those have to be labeled manually. The reason why is because there's no way for us to know what's part of a dividend reinvestment plan and what is not, because of how brokers report. Also, you could have some shares of stock that are part of a dividend reinvestment and some shares that are not. So I'll show you real quickly here. If we go to the Find menu and we choose ticker, I can put in, let's say, for example, I'll put in Baidu here. Let's say that this particular security was part of a dividend reinvestment plan, or maybe just certain shares of it. What I can do is just select either all of this ticker, or I can select just the trades, the shares that are part of the dividend reinvestment, and go to the Edit menu, and there's an option for Change Type and Multiplier. And that's where I can change my security type to a DRP-1, which stands for Dividend Reinvestments. And then I can just click OK, and that's going to change the type, as you'll see, to Dividend Reinvestment. And it'll ask me to save the records. I'm going to click No because I don't want to save what I changed. Okay, so that's something that you have to do manually. If you do have that situation, we have instructions in our help guide for that, or you can contact our support department. I haven't seen too many people that have had to make those adjustments, but if you do, we have that function. Okay, so now that I have my TradeLog data file, in this particular file I'll highlight, just because someone will probably bring it up if I don't, the last date in here is December 16th. For this particular account, I actually stopped trading on December 16th, so there is no trade data through January 2012. So again, that last date field shows what the last trade date is, so that's important to use. But I just want to make sure everyone knows, because someone will probably point out otherwise and say that I failed to complete one of those steps. Well, I did. I imported everything that I've got in this particular file. So the next step we're going to do, we verified our opens, everything matches up in here, is we want to talk about our 1099 reconciliation. And when I go to the Reports menu and go to Gains and Losses and Tax Forms, here I have the Reconcile 1099B. And this, when I click on that, you'll notice a difference if you used to use TradeLog in the past. Before, we used to have a yellow box where you entered your gross proceeds. Well, now we need to ask a lot more information about your 1099 in order to try to reconcile. You'll notice two notes, and we'll discuss this more. We're only going to reconcile total sales to your 1099. The cost basis information, we will actually make adjustments for the purpose of reconciliation. That'll be on Form 8949. So we'll get to that later. But this box is where we collect this information. So I think Tony asked a question about reconciling after combining accounts. You have to reconcile the 1099 on individual accounts before you combine them. The reason being is we need to capture each of these numbers for each individual account, as well as the 1099B details. Let me explain some of this more specifically so you can understand. On the left side, we have some totals. These are numbers that you need to get from your 1099B. The first number is your gross proceeds. Okay, and so this is the gross proceeds number that's just like what your broker has actually reported in the past. They're reporting that still. Now you'll notice we mentioned that if your broker does not provide a total of the gross proceeds, then you may have to add up the totals for each section. Your broker might have long-term, short-term, covered, non-covered. They might have separate sections. So if they have things segregated and they don't give you a total gross proceeds, then what you'll want to do is add up the total proceeds from each of those sections to get this grand total. That's been something we've seen why some people have reconciliation problems. They just didn't add it all up. The other numbers here we need are cost basis numbers. One thing I want to highlight that's in the notes, but some people are missing it, this is the total reported cost basis for short-term or long-term. So if you've joined us on our other webinar sessions, or if you've watched it online, we've talked about things you need to know for 2011 tax filing. So one of the things that we talked about is the difference between reported and non-reported, or covered and non-covered securities. So even though your broker may list a cost basis on the 1099, they should be telling you if it was reported to the IRS or not. And what we want in these boxes are the reported numbers, because obviously that's what we're concerned about. We want to make sure that TradeLog matches up with what the IRS was told is reported for certain sections. So we have short-term and long-term. We've got some notes down here regarding this. Most people won't have long-term, so you can just leave it blank if you don't have any long-term. As far as the notes on here, one thing you want to remember, again, this is reported. You can look at box 6 on your 1099, which will identify whether a security is covered or non-covered. And if your broker didn't give you the total for reported cost basis, then you should request that they do so. What we're finding specifically with Fidelity and Schwab brokerages right now are the two we've seen that do not segregate out covered versus non-covered, or the reported versus non-reported. They group it all together. So that would require that you actually go in and add up the individual trades that were reported and those that weren't reported, and that's kind of a pain in the butt. So you don't want to have to do that. So we encourage you to contact your broker and ask them about that. And Tony asked a good question. I'll stop right here. As far as the cost basis for non-reported or non-covered securities, you don't need to enter that anywhere in here because we're not concerned about reconciling. If you want to learn more about reconciling, I'll show you a link a little bit later, but non-covered securities means your broker doesn't necessarily know the cost basis, or the cost basis may not be correct. So what we're concerned about is these numbers, because this is part of our audit reduction, I should say, so that we can try to reduce any risk of being audited by the IRS. Let me cancel out of this real quick, and I want to show you on the 1099 that I have from Ameritrade, show you a little bit where we find these numbers. And I see a couple of questions about some other brokers, so we'll try to talk about those here in just a moment as well. So here we have a TD Ameritrade 1099. Most of the brokers are doing pretty good. A lot of them will give you a summary. So here on the first page, it's nice because Ameritrade gives us that number we need, total gross proceeds less commissions. They also give us the total cost basis that's reported. The only thing is this total doesn't break out short-term or long-term, but I'll show you later where we could confirm that as well. So that, especially we like that number there, that gross proceeds, that's important. What I'll do is show you the next pages down. So here on page 2, you'll notice, let me turn my spotlight on so you can see where I'm talking about. What Ameritrade does is they break down, they segregate sections of the report based on whether it's short-term or long-term, and whether the cost basis was reported or not reported. They even give you some help telling you where these would be found on the 8949, which was great. So first set here is short-term transactions where a basis was reported. So if I go to the end of this section here, and I had a note telling me what page that was just to help me out. I think we're on page 41. Yes. So at the end of this short-term section, we'll see we have the total cost basis just for the short term, and we have the total amount that was reported for sales. So this is the cost basis number that I'm going to want to enter on my 1099 for short-term reported securities. Underneath this section, we have short-term transactions for which basis was not reported to the IRS. So underneath here are securities that were uncovered. So you'll notice the broker actually left cost basis blank. Sometimes they might list cost basis, but just because it's listed doesn't mean it was reported. If they say it's not reported, it wasn't reported. It's just there for your information. But I do have my sales amounts, and these have been included in that total. If my broker did not give me a total, then I would need to add this sales figure to the one that we saw up here for this other section. This report only has 2 sections on it for this particular 1099B, so it's fairly simple. As I mentioned, some brokers are going to have a long-term section for uncovered securities. Some might actually have some might actually have long-term covered securities. I know Tony made the question that we don't have cost basis for long-term. Well, most people don't. Technically, the broker did not have to track long-term. They didn't have to track cost basis until January 1, 2011. However, technically, the wash sale rule can cause some short-term trades to become long-term. So a few brokers are reporting long-term cost basis, and it's either because of the wash sale rule that they did this or because they just messed it up, and we've seen both. So if your broker reported long-term, whether it's correct or not, you should go ahead and put it in TradeLog. That way we can make sure and compensate for it, because unless your broker corrects their 1099, that's what the IRS is going to be told. So we want to make sure we account for it. Very rare, and there's not many of you who will have to see long-term, but it is out there. Okay, 1 second. Let me just look at a few of the questions here. Let's see here. Chip, you asked about 1099s from interactive brokers. For the most part, IB has a pretty good 1099, and I think, let me look real quick. I have a list here. Yeah, it looks like there's the only questions about IB may come up with short sales. It's a little confusing because they've been changing the date of the short sale so that the date that you entered the sale is the same date as when you covered, which is a little bit confusing. But as far as the amounts are correct, and also they do report option premiums. I'll discuss that in a minute. So, but for the most part, 1099s from IB are pretty good. The one exception I'll say that we've heard some questions is if you have foreign currency trades, or excuse me, if you're trading foreign stock, which is in a foreign currency. There's been some questions that have come up about how IB handles that, because what they're reporting on their 1099 and what they report on their statements is a little bit different. So if you have that situation and you're seeing a problem, let us know. Let's see here. Mike, you asked about if Fidelity will only give, will not provide the reported amounts. Can you use their number? You would have to go in and add it up. You don't want to enter the wrong number for cost basis, because that can create an adjustment in TradeLog that you might not want. So, you know, you want to contact us if you're having problems with that, and we can talk about some of your options and what you might be able to do. But it is a problem right now with both Fidelity and Schwab on not providing clean information. And I'll mention this, that the IRS has already given some guidance that next year they're going to expect all 1099-Bs to be segregated, like this one I'm looking at from Ameritrade. So Fidelity and Schwab already are going to have to overhaul their 1099-B for next year, because the IRS has said, hey, what you've done is not really giving good information. It's all there, it just makes a lot more work for both you and for the IRS. Okay, so now that we've seen that on the 1099, let's go back over here to TradeLog and talk about entering this again. Now, a couple things you'll see in the current versions of TradeLog. There's a button down here that can reset this form. So you can reset this entire form, it'll empty the fields out, or you can also delete these fields. Now, if you put a 0 in any of these fields, it'll work. You can also leave them blank. Some of you may not have gross proceeds, and that's because you had like option trades. So if that was the case, you can just leave that blank. If you didn't have any gross proceeds, you didn't have any reported cost basis. If you put a 0 in here, TradeLog will make an adjustment in the 8949 if it needs to be adjusted down to 0. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead and I have my gross proceeds number in here, I have my cost basis. But I want to talk about the right-hand side. Here we have 1099-B details. So we want to check the boxes here that apply to my 1099. Now by default you should see the last 3 boxes checked because most brokers are reporting mutual funds on Form B, most brokers are reporting DRIPs on Form B, and most brokers are reporting ETFs on Form A. And that's what we talk about in these notes. What we have noticed, some users are going in and unchecking all these boxes. That could cause you problems. So unless you know for sure that your broker isn't reporting something, you could just leave these as they are. It won't hurt you. Let me see one quick. Chip, you asked a question. No, Chip, non-covered trades don't get reported here on this cost basis. This is only reported cost basis. So all we did was take the short-term reported cost basis. The non-covered doesn't apply on that. And I'll show you where this number comes into play a little bit later and why we're doing that. One thing I want to mention, a lot of brokers now, it varies, but a lot of them are reporting adjustments for option premiums. So if you're trading options and you had options that were expired or exercised and assigned, then they're going to adjust the sales for that. My broker here, Ameritrade, is an example. Oftentimes they'll tell you that. If you look here on this first page of my Ameritrade 1099, back up here to the first page, they actually say gross proceeds less commissions and option premiums. So that tells me they're adjusting for options. Today I've seen a lot of users who their gross sales were off, and that was the reason. They hadn't compensated for option premiums. Okay? None of you will probably check the first box here for options because those are not required until 2013. Okay? Now this particular broker that I have with Ameritrade, they did report ETFs. Okay? They report those as covered. But I want to highlight one thing, and I'm going to show you how we're going to account for this. When I go back down there to that non-covered section, it's good to take note, well, what is my broker reporting as non-covered and why? This broker is not reporting a certain ETF as covered, and that's the S&P 500 VXX. I have no idea why they aren't reporting this as a covered security, but as I mentioned, ETFs come under interpretation, and brokers are all over the board on that. So this is going to possibly cause a discrepancy in my trade log because I have one ETF that's not being reported as a covered security. All the rest of them are. I'll show you how we're going to adjust that in just a moment. For now, I'm going to go ahead and leave ETFs checked because most of my ETFs are covered securities. When I go down to the bottom here, I have the option to print out this information if I want to save it for my records. This is saved with this particular brokerage account. Now, I might have a brokerage account at Fidelity or Schwab or somewhere else, and these options might be different. So that's why you have to reconcile on an individual account basis. When I run the reconciliation report, and again, this is a report that is just for your use only. It doesn't go to the IRS, but this is just telling you how TradeLog sales numbers match up with the 1099. So we make the adjustments here just as you indicated in those check boxes and based on how brokers adjust. We even give you some notes here on the side. And you'll notice here my difference is 1 penny. So that's perfect. That's what I want. We have a note that you want your difference to be either right on or positive, preferably. But if it's a large difference, whether it be positive or negative, you might want to be concerned. But negative differences are a red flag to the IRS. Now, if it's like $50 under, that's, in this case I have 45 million in sales. It's not a big deal. But if it's like $100 or 1,000 or a couple thousand or $1 million, then that's an indication that something's wrong. Either something's missing from TradeLog or your broker has misreported sales. And don't rule out that broker part because we have seen some serious problems with some brokers who have messed up their reporting of gross proceeds. Let's see, 1 second here. Okay, Glenn, I'm not 100% sure on your question. You asked about reconciling your IB. Stick with me and we'll come back and we'll revisit that in a moment here. So this number, this is important. I want to make sure that my difference is reasonable here. And if there is a problem and you can't get that to reconcile and you can't figure out why, we have some notes here at the bottom of this that we talk about some of the reasons why it may not reconcile. You can also go to our help file, and we provide some guidance in our help instructions on how to look for discrepancies. And if you have a problem and you just can't find it, you can send us your TradeLog data file along with your 1099B, and we will review it. Now, I will tell you that we have a lot of files being sent in, so it's not going to happen like instantly, but usually within 24 hours or so we can get your file reviewed and see if we can identify what the problem may be. So once I've run this reconciliation report, I might print this out just for my records, and I'd want to do this for each of my individual data files. This makes sure that my TradeLog data is looking good. I verified my open position, so I should be ready to go on to my reporting. I'm going to exit out of this. Normally the next step at this point would be to end the tax year. But one thing I'm encouraging users is to just take a peek at your 8949. Now if you have only one data file, you don't have to worry too much. Your report's accurate right now, but this is very important. I want to emphasize this. If you have multiple files, if you have brokerage files with different brokers, or even with the same broker, but you have multiple accounts, you do not file your 8949 until you've combined those accounts, because otherwise you haven't adjusted wash sales across all accounts. So I'm going to show you right now, we're going to run the 8949, but you want to go ahead and do the other steps of combining, ending the tax year before you do your final tax one. What I'm going to show you when I run the 8949 is here it lists all of the securities. We have our Form A. This is the securities where the basis was reported. We have Form B further down here. I'll have to scroll down real quick. Okay, so getting to the end, here's Form B. So at the end of Form A, I have an adjustment line to reconcile. Remember the number we entered for short-term cost basis? This is where this comes into play. Talking with various CPA advisors, we feel it's important that the total cost basis that we report on Form A match what your broker reported on the 1099. Even though your broker's 1099 may not be 100% accurate, it helps to reduce audit flags. So what we have here is an adjustment line. The IRS says code B is the adjustment we would use for cost basis. And what we're saying is basically we're reconciling the difference. The 1099B was $15,000 difference with my total cost basis. So we've made that adjustment in the column for cost basis, and on the far right you'll see a column G, which is adjustments. So here we make the adjustment over here. So what the net gain and loss that we get is the same. So we're not tinkering with our taxable gain and loss. We're just showing the reconciliation. So the IRS computers are able to match us up, and they see that we've matched with our 1099 from our broker. Now, one of the things we'll tell you in the notes at the very end of this form, there's a final page that talks about this adjustment and why we're making this adjustment. We also talk about reconciling. I encourage you to read that so that it gives you the confidence that what you're filing is correct. One of the things we mention is that if that particular adjustment is very large or material, then you might want to be concerned. Now, in this particular instance, I have looked at this $15,000 adjustment, and what I found was that this is all a result of different wash sale adjustments. In fact, it's interesting because if you look at my total wash sales now of 114,000, if I go over to my broker, this doesn't always happen, but if I go over to the broker, you notice it actually matches with the wash sales that they reported in the adjustment column. So that's where I know that difference is TradeLog's reporting wash sales a little bit differently than the broker. And remember, the broker doesn't have to do wash sales as you're required on 8949. So you are going to have those differences. But now, as I think a few of you have mentioned, some of you might have $1 million differences or more. Big differences here. You might want to take a further look and say, why is that number so off? And one of the things that's often the cause that we're finding right now is that your broker is reporting weird things, such as, for example, on this particular file, remember I mentioned VXX, my VIX ETFs. They're reporting these as non-covered. So that could throw off my number. Now, I've already compensated, and let me show you what I did here in TradeLog, because some of you may have the same situation. I'm going to exit out of this report, and I want to show you what I did with VXX. If I do find ticker and I type in VXX, what I did is I actually classified these with the type code for drips, DRP. They're not actually drips, but what that does is it tells TradeLog to put this on Form B. All right, we have no way right now in TradeLog to go in and say, hey, force this particular trade or security to a different form. We are working on that. That's something that from some situations we're going to have. But as most of you know, this has all been a game of catch up, keep up with what the IRS is trying to do. So as we see these broker discrepancies, we've realized that we're going to have to do something for that. So for right now, this was my fix, is I put VXX as a drip, and what that does is it forces it on column B. All right, it doesn't hurt anything in my calculations. So if you have a situation like that, you can contact us to double check, but that might be the fix. Some brokers are also doing a little bit different. Some will put all ETFs on Form B as non-covered, and only certain ones like Spider they're putting as covered. They're treating it like securities. So if that's the case, we do this a little differently. We mark that as a stock, which would put it on Form A. So there are some workarounds. So if you have that scenario and you have a big discrepancy, contact us. We'll take a look. And anytime, I'll mention this, I'm going to mention again later, anytime you have a big adjustment or you have a big discrepancy, if you're sending that to us here at TradeLog to look at, please send a copy of your 1099-D along with your data file, because that way we can see what your broker reported, we can see your data file, and we can get you a quickest solution. So on the 1099-B, I had that VIX on Form B. Well, now let's go back to that gain and loss. I'll go to 8949, and oops, I need to go back here. I still had that isolated. I had to click all. Okay. 8949. So now if I go down to the end of this report, we're going to notice that my VXX is being reported on Form B. So checkbox B. So that's where these are all being reported now. And again, the question came up about non-covered securities. All right, if your broker gave you cost basis for the non-covered securities, then that should tie into Form B. But most brokers don't have complete cost basis, or in this case for Ameritrade, I know they didn't report it at all for VIX. So there's nothing really to compare, and it's okay because we're working off the transaction history. All right, at the end of this, I want to show you something we have at the end of the 8949. This particular page is a form that gives its instructions for Schedule D. Okay, this is not an actual tax form. It's just to help you out. This tells you the totals from all the 8949s we generated and where they flow into the Schedule D. It also helps you understand your reconciliation. For example, gross proceeds. Remember we talked about that? The boxes that are in blue, when you add those up, they should be greater than or equal to your gross proceeds number. So that's where those numbers are going into. The boxes in red, that's what we're comparing to those cost basis numbers we entered. So your broker only reports those two boxes to the IRS. The rest of this information you are responsible for reporting. So your broker, or the IRS isn't going to be checking. They have nothing to check against on that. But that's why what we're doing is adjusting so that column F, those two boxes, match your 1099. So this is a good time to take your 1099 out and again check and say, hey, how does that look? Yeah, those match up. Okay, that's going to help reduce audit flags, okay, when you file your taxes. And as I mentioned, we have additional information on here regarding Form 8949. We talk about why we're making these adjustments, how TradeLog does these, and if you do have a very large adjustment, then you would want to make sure and understand where that's coming from. It's not to say that it's not possible to have a large adjustment. Some people are trying to reconcile their cost basis perfectly. If you want to do that, then I don't know why you're even using TradeLog, because the bottom line is your broker on the 1099-B, they're not required to report the same things that you have to report on the 8949. So even if you got your cost basis perfect, well, now your tax filing may be incorrect. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, I'm going to pause for just a moment here, and I'm going to talk about ending the tax year next, and we're going to talk about filing your taxes. But I want to take a look. I see we have some questions and see if there's any questions I need to address right now. Glenn, you mentioned about the adjustment, the positive difference on your 8949. What I would suggest is if you want to send us your TradeLog file and your 1099-B to our support department and ask if we can review that, we can take a quick look over your 1099-B just to make sure that there's nothing that stands out. Like you mentioned, for $6 million in proceeds, that might be about right because of wash sales, but we can kind of confirm that for you and help you understand why that adjustment is there. Thomas, you asked a great question. I just saw this earlier today. You mentioned that Penson listed most trades as non-covered. I just dealt with another user actually who said, I looked at their 1099. They had stocks that were being reported as non-covered by Penson, and I have no idea why, because everything based on the IRS rules says that those should be covered. So what I told that user is they probably want to ask Penson why they're reporting that, because I think Penson needs to reissue and amend that 1099. And guys, don't be surprised if you see that, because a lot of brokers are amending their 1099-Bs right now. In fact, I heard about one broker today who they haven't even issued their 1099s yet. I think they're supposed to release them either March 15th or April. They're one of those very late ones, and they've messed up all of their short sales. Are messed up on their 1099. So they actually contacted us and some of our partners trying to get help on how to fix their 1099s. So Thomas, I would definitely ask the broker to explain why those aren't covered, because pretty much if you bought a stock, a regular old stock, if you bought it in 2011 and you sold it in 2011, the IRS says that's a covered security. It needs to be reported. And like I said, I'm seeing things that don't make sense from Penson. Chip, you asked about if it's off billions of dollars, if your reconciliation is off, should you start over? Again, that would be one probably to send us your data file and let us take a look at that, because I'd hate to see you have to start all over again. But there might be something that hits us right away, especially if it's such a large discrepancy. So send us that file along with your 1099 if you can, and we can see the difference there. And as you mentioned, futures trades, that could affect, depending on how your broker reported them and how they're listed in TradeLog. So definitely send that in to us so we can take a look at it. Dave, you asked a great question about index funds and ETFs that qualify for Section 1256. For broad-based index options, we do account for those. TradeLog picks those up and recognizes them as futures. With ETFs, there's some guidance that I know Green Trader Tax provides about how those are handled. And so TradeLog right now handles the actual buy and sale of ETF as a security, as a normal stock type security, because according to what we've seen, it's the dividend returns that are handled at Section 1256. If you have specific questions on that, you can contact our support department, or you might check out greentradertax.com or greencompany.com. Bob Green has a great blog article that talks about ETFs and index options. Mike asked a good question. I'm glad you picked up on this. As far as on your report screen, if you notice, there's a section here that says Form 4797, Section 481. I'm using TradeLog MTM, so this version of TradeLog I'm using has mark-to-market ability. If you're not using TradeLog MTM, you won't see that little green section there. So, okay. Let me look at a few more questions, and then we're going to move on here. Tony, you asked about that adjustment line. Again, that adjustment line on the Form 8949, what that's doing is it's making sure that your total cost basis matches what your broker reported. It can be positive or negative. It just depends. As far as the size of it, if it's a big difference, what I would say, it depends on a lot of factors, your total sales, your total cost basis. It depends on the amount of wash sales. If you're not sure, if you're concerned about the difference, send in your file to us along with your 1099. We can take a look at it and probably help identify what's causing that difference. Why it can be positive, why it can be negative, that just depends on a lot of factors. For example, wash sale adjustments. Some brokers are pushing more wash sale adjustments forward. Some are pushing some back. So that's just basically, if you have a negative, that means that TradeLog had, let's see, I think that would mean TradeLog had a higher cost basis than your broker reported, whereas like in my example here, I had a lower cost basis, so that's why it's positive. Tony, you asked about as well total cost basis. They reported together. They didn't segregate short-term and long-term. You might look at the fine print because you may have only had short-term, but they should report on it. If anything, they should tell you if each trade was short-term or long-term. That is required by the IRS. And again, if you're not sure, you can always send in your 1099 to us, and we can look at it and tell you where they're showing that difference. Okay, I'm going to continue now. I do have some more questions here, and we'll answer those as well, but I want to go ahead and move along for those of you who are going to have to leave soon. Okay, and Mike, I'll just address that real quick too. If you send in your 1099, your TradeLog file, that's great. As I mentioned, we've had a lot of files sent in, so we are working through those in the order in which they're received. So most people who sent them in yesterday are getting those reviewed by today. Some of them might have been sent in prior to yesterday. Those are being reviewed as well. So if you don't hear back within, I'd say, 24 hours of sending your file, then you might check with us and just see so we didn't let you fall through the crack at all. Okay, so let's talk about, before I talk about filing our taxes, because I want to remind you, if you have multiple brokerage accounts, you need to combine your brokerage accounts before you file your taxes. You reconcile the 1099 first. All that the information you entered in about your 1099 is going to be saved with your file. And when we create a combined file, we're going to know exactly how to report all of those trades. So down here under Step 6 on the Quick Start Guide, I'm pointing at my Quick Start panel right now, we actually give it the instructions for you here about what you need to do to end the tax year. And so first is if you need to combine files, just go to the File Combine menu, and it tells you this should only be done at year end. Click yes if that's what you want to do. You're going to put the tax year in, it's 2011. You're going to create the name, and then you're going to select the files that you want to combine together. So if I have multiple files, I select them, and then I hit open. And what it's going to do is it's going to create a new file that's going to have all of my brokerage accounts in them. So that will be my reporting file. You make sure you did your 1099 reconciliation because you won't be able to do it in the combined. Of course, if you need to go back and edit anything or you need to go back and redo your reconciliation, you can do it on the individual accounts, and you can create a combined file again and just overwrite. Once you've done that, once you've created the combined file, or if you don't have multiple accounts, if you just have one data file, when you're ready, go to the File and choose In Tax Year, Create Next Tax Year Data File. If you're using TradeLog MTM version, then it's going to ask you some questions about mark-to-market. I'm going to click No on that because that doesn't apply. Then it's going to ask you if you imported all of your trades through January 2012. If no, you want to go and, of course, do that, as I mentioned. But in this case, I did, so I'm going to click Yes. And it's asking, because I already created this file, it's asking to overwrite. I'll say Yes. And now it tells me everything's complete. So what it did is TradeLog ended the tax year and created the files for the next tax year. So if I actually go into my Open menu, you'll see I have a 2012 Ameritrade file. If I had any positions in January 2012 or any wash sales that carried over or open positions, all of that's going to be moved to that other file. So this is an important step, and if you've been with us for several years, you know that we keep trying to get that ingrained in everyone. Don't forget to end the tax year, because that saves you so much work when you use TradeLog next year. So make sure and run that. Once I've ended the tax year, now I can go ahead and run my reports for my tax filing. To do that, I'm going to go back again to the 8949. If this was a combined account, I want to make sure and run it from the combined TradeLog data file. Okay. So when I do the 8949, let's talk about how I can use this. I'm going to go all the way to the end again. Excuse me, just one second. Getting a little dry there. So here at the end, we give you the summary page. If you are actually filing hard copy, you're filling out your own tax forms, you can use these totals to fill out on Schedule D. Okay, these totals actually go in. And then you'll use the forms that we provided before that. You can just print those out and use them. Some tax software, you can also just enter the totals in and use the 8949s that we create and send that along. All right, we do also support some popular tax software programs. TurboTax and TaxAct, we have export buttons here at the top. TurboTax, if you click on that, it actually creates a tax exchange file, a TXF file. This works with TurboTax. It also works with some other tax software programs, though I will say that we're hearing reports, for example, that H&R Block, that their software, I think it's TaxCut, that it's having problems reading the TXF. We've created the TXF the way TurboTax said to do it, and basically some software just has a hard time with it. So that's why we say this is created for TurboTax, but you can use the same file in other software. You'll save your file, and then you'll follow our instructions to actually do your tax reporting. You get a warning here. If there was an adjustment line, remember the adjustment line that we had at the end of Form A? If you have that adjustment, when you import data into TurboTax or TaxAct, that adjustment will not be imported. You have to manually enter it. This is because the popular tax software programs, they're not able to handle that particular adjustment line in their imports. But we do give you instructions how to enter that manually, and I'll show you that in a moment. Same with TaxAct. Now, TaxAct generates a CSV file, and I think someone asked earlier about that. Is there a way to generate a CSV file? So you can use the TaxAct CSV, and usually that has all the data that you would need from the 8949, and that's the same file that you would use to import the TaxAct. Same process, create the file name, save it, you get the same warning. Now also another option, you can actually click the copy button, and that'll copy all of your data. And I could now go over to Microsoft Excel. Let me put this on the right screen. There we go. And I can just paste that data, and there it has all of the data for my 8949 entered in to Excel. So sometimes your CPA might want that, or you might want that. You can go in and use it from that format. Okay. Of course, you can print it out. You can create a PDF. One thing we remind you, the last 2 pages are just for your information. Don't file those with your taxes, please. It might mess up something with the IRS. So those are just for your information. On the additional information page, we do talk about if you have a complex situation where you have very large adjustments, you may want to consider consulting with a CPA or a tax advisor regarding your situation, especially if the adjustment is legitimate. You know, it's very possible. I've seen some very large adjustments. One of the things our partners over at Green Trader Tax, they suggest adding a footnote, maybe including an addendum with your tax return that just explains to the IRS what we're telling you right here, that how you filed your taxes and the fact that your broker's 1099-B is incorrect. The IRS knows that the brokers have a difficult time reporting on 1099, and in fact, you're going to see more and more. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal. You're going to see more articles posted from authorities who are trying to get the word out that this whole reporting thing is a mess. In fact, the American Institute of CPAs, AICPA, they are even making some recommendations to the IRS based on their analysis of this problem, because so many 1099-Bs are messed up or just not correct. And it's really not the broker's fault. They're trying to do the best they can with a set of rules that are almost impossible for them. So we can't say we blame them, but the reality is we're just getting a lot of different things. So let me show you now, if you're using TurboTax and TaxAct, I want to show you how to find those instructions for filing that. If I go to the Help menu, I actually like to go to the Quick Start Guide, and under Step 8 of our Quick Start Guide is File Your Taxes. Here we have the instructions for TaxAct and for TurboTax. So if I click on TaxAct, it tells me how to export my file, and at the end I click on the next set of instructions and I'm ready to import. And with TaxAct, you can only import up to 1,000 records. If you have more than 1,000 records, then follow our instructions here on how to enter the data into TaxAct. You can just enter your totals in. You can still e-file. You'll just need to send in Form 8453. All right. If you are able to import in the TaxAct, we give you some warnings and some notes here about what you need to know to make sure you file accurately. And there is the instructions for your cost basis adjustment factor. We actually put it at the end. So after you follow these step-by-step instructions, we take you all the way through. At the end, if you need to enter that manual adjustment, click on that link, and we're going to explain how to do that in TaxAct. It's pretty simple. So just have the number that your 8949 reports. With TaxAct, it's 5 steps. It's really pretty simple. Now, if you're with TurboTax, it's a little more tedious. Let me go back here, to Filing Taxes and click on the TurboTax instructions. Okay. Now, TurboTax limits you to 3,000 records. Okay. So after you've exported your data, we have a note. If you have more than 3,000 records, then you'll need to enter your totals manually into TurboTax for their Schedule D. If I click on the instructions to import, one thing I want to mention is excuse me one second, just looking at a question we had. Okay, I'll cover that in a second. One thing I want to mention is TurboTax, you can only import in their CD versions, their download version. So if you're trying to import online, it doesn't work. They don't support TXF files online. So you'll need to buy their download version. I think their cheapest one's $29. We have all the instructions for importing into TurboTax. If you need to enter the manual cost basis adjustment factor, it is a little more tedious, but we give you step-by-step how to do that. I think it's a total of like 13 steps for TurboTax. But we explain how to do it and also how to double-check to make sure what you entered matches up at the end. So that's the instructions, and like I mentioned, the best way to find them, go to our Quick Start Guide and click on Step 8 for filing your taxes, and we're going to have that that information in there. Once you've done that, you're all set. You can take a deep breath and start counting down till 2012. Now, I will mention here, just a reminder as well, we've told some users this, if you have a very complicated situation, your 1099 is way off, we're trying to get things fixed from a broker, we can't figure out stuff, our friends over at Green Trader Tax, they're actually recommending to users, and we are as well, if you have a very complex situation, it's quite possible that things aren't going to get sorted out before April 15th, especially if you need your broker to amend their 1099-B. So you may consider filing an extension, working on that first. Once you get the extension filed, then go ahead and work on resolving your final tax reporting. And of course, when you file an extension, most CPAs will recommend that you go ahead and pay any estimated taxes due. That way you can help avoid some of the fees that could be incurred. Okay, so that's the main thing we wanted to show today. And of course, if you have questions and support, you can contact us. In a moment, I'm going to answer some more of these questions here, but I just wanted to make mention of, again, if you're sending stuff to us in support, you can always send your data file by going to Help and choose Send File to Support. All right, of course, you can go to our online support center at TradeLogSoftware.com, and you can send files through here. You can call us on the telephone. Our phone support has been getting inundated. The last couple days is starting to ease up a little bit. So if you call and you go straight to voicemail, the reason is because our hold time is so long that we want to go ahead and let you just leave a message, and we return your call as soon as possible. Okay, so let's answer some questions here. If you have to take off, as I mentioned, thank you for joining us. I will send you an email as soon as the video of this presentation is on YouTube, so if you need to go back and review anything. And we're also having these classes each day this week, so if you need to come back, you can. All right, let's talk about a few of the questions here. Thomas just left, but just to highlight something with wash sales, if you have a wash sale, your broker might say it's disallowed. It's kind of confusing when they say disallowed losses. It's only disallowed for that particular trade. It wasn't disallowed for the entire year. So that's something to keep in mind. In fact, one of the brokers has admitted that they should not have listed as disallowed. It confused people, and they're getting a lot of questions. I'm going to go back to the beginning here. I think, Chip, I think I helped you there with you can put the data into Excel. That helps find some discrepancies. And as I mentioned, if you send us your file, I think we can help out on your situation. I think we answered Mike's question on the 8949. Mike, if you enter numbers manually, if you do enter the totals that we gave you there in TradeLog on that gain and loss report, those have accounted for any adjustments, so no need to make any other adjustments. So if you're entering manual into your tax software, just put these numbers in and then just attach your 8949 along with Form 8453. That basically tells the IRS this is an attachment to your e-filing, and it goes to what they call the Great Shredder in the Midwest, or out in, actually that's in Texas, is I think where they're taking those documents now. I don't know that they actually shred them, but some CPAs think they just disappear. But that's what you're going to do, is enter those totals in. All right. And again, Tony, when you talk about wash sales, your broker might say that they have a disallowed wash sale, but that doesn't mean it was deferred to the next tax year. Again, brokers are they're not getting the terminology quite right. So TradeLog, if it says you don't have any disallowed wash sales, that means you didn't have any losses that you didn't get to take this year. You might still show a gain or loss or an adjustment column, but when you add those numbers up, that's what gets you your total gain or loss. Henry, you asked about version 9.1.5. So yeah, if if you're prompted to install 9.1.5, basically what we're doing is, if you see that 9.1, it's still version 9.1, but 0.5 usually is a more minor release. What we're doing is just fixing little hiccups that come up here and there, bugs that do come up. So certain people might have had a problem running a function, and so if we have to do a fix, we release that for everyone. So if you install 9.1.5, it's not going to change the way we calculate gains and losses or anything like that. It might, if you had a particular situation, sometimes we've maybe made slight adjustments to handle certain situations, but it's not going to change your reporting. Tony, you're asking again about the disallowed wash sales. Again, just keep in mind, folks, when your broker reports a 1099-B, that is third-party information. It doesn't exempt you from doing Form 8949. So if your broker says something on there about disallowed wash sales, as I just mentioned, what they're probably talking about is the wash sales that are being reported in column G. And though they were disallowed within the individual trades, they're not disallowed for the year. And so that's where it's sometimes a matter of terminology, but you need to file your 8949, and TradeLog, is doing this correctly. So the way your broker does their adjustments, they're not even required to adjust wash sales in the way that you're required on Form 8949. Chip, you asked about filing Form 1065. We actually don't have a separate webinar planned on that right now. If you stick with me in just a minute here, I'll go ahead and just show you what you need to know for 1065 because it's really easy. Let me answer a couple of these other questions real quick. Securities that are covered for 2012, Roger, that's a great question. The best way to find it is to go to our tax topics, Form 8949. And we have a link here for, on the right side, Understanding IRS 8949 Categories. And on there, we actually list what determines if a security is covered or non-covered. As I mentioned, a few things are up to interpretation, like with ETFs and ETNs, but we do tell you what the IRS has said and what brokers are reporting. So that's a good resource to check out. If you have a question about that, and especially if you think something that your broker reported is uncovered is not right. Mike, you asked about Form 8453. That should be generated by your tax software like TurboTax or TaxAct. They generate the Form 8453, which you then print out and send with your TradeLog reporting. We don't do that because the Form 8453 may include other items as well. So the actual tax software program you're using is going to do that. Yeah, and this actually, just back to that question there, this is for 2011 it'll show you, but we also include, we tell you what's, for example, mutual funds and DRIPs and ETFs. In 2012, all of these will be covered. Options and futures will not be covered, or options won't be covered until 2013. Future contracts are not covered at all because those go on Section 1256. Mike, yes, the 8453 is only for e-filing. So if you're printing out your return and sending it, you don't need Form 8453. But what that form does is if you e-filed your 1040, basically 8453 tells the IRS that you have some additional paperwork that you're sending, supplementary worksheets and such, and those get attached to that and sent in. So they're able to put that in file, and if they need it, they pull it out. Tony, you asked about version 9.1.5. Yes, you can use that to file your tax return. If everything reconciles and balances, you could actually use version 9.1. Anything after 9.1, we're giving the okay on for filing your taxes if everything reconciles on that 1099 reconciliation and if you are satisfied with the adjustments. Okay, that answered most of those questions. If you have another question, shoot it in now. I'll give a few more minutes while I'm waiting for any other questions. Chip, I'm going to show you about 1065. If you are filing Form 1065, which is for partnerships, you actually are really lucky this year. Let me open up TradeLog, because you don't have to do the 8949. I don't know what they're going to do next year. They might change that, but it makes it a lot easier. So if you are filing 1065, we still want you to go in here and reconcile your gross proceeds, but you don't have to worry about cost basis. You can just leave that blank. And you also don't have to worry about, well, go ahead on the right side here. You'll want to fill out what your broker reported on the 1099-B, but it's not going to concern you as far as the 8949. So make sure your gross proceeds reconciles, run that reconciliation report. This needs to match up here. Once that reconciles and you verified your open positions, rather than running 8949, you can just run the gain and loss report. You'll notice when I hover over here, it says substitute schedule D1. Because for 1065 filing, you still get to use the old forms for the IRS, the D1. I shouldn't say old, but the old format that everyone used to use. So when I run the gain and loss report, you'll actually notice the totals, the gain and loss number is the same as the 8949. It's just the format. This formats your trades in the way the D1 is formatted. It's not an identical form, but this is accepted as a substitute D1. So you'll just take the totals from this report. There's only one section on the D1, or two. There's a long-term and short-term, but in this case I only have short-term. You'll just take these totals, and those flow on to the appropriate fields on Schedule D. Schedule D is going to ask you for sales, cost basis, gain and loss. So now that's only for filing 1065. So if you're not filing for a partnership, don't use this form. But Chip, for you, if you're filing 1065, you get to just print out this easy report. You don't have to worry about those adjustments or any of that other stuff because the IRS doesn't care. Okay. So it looks like we've answered all the questions, and it's about 5:20, so I'm actually going to be cutting out of here. As I said, if you have other questions, feel free to contact our support department, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. You can call us, you can email us, you can visit our support center online, and we will be able to help you out. And if you especially have a reconciliation problem, send us your TradeLog file and your 1099-B. That way we can see both of them and we can get you the best help. So thanks all for joining us today, and I hope to see you on a future webinar event.